Welcome to Halva for the Heart, Dying and Grieving in Diaspora. My name is Misha. I'm an Iranian-American death doula and grief tender, and my practice is called Hafiz Death Care. Today I wanted to record an episode about fibers and textile art as grief care. I am leading my third gathering of this Fibers of Grief event that I started in September. We've been meeting monthly the first Thursday of the month, and we cycle through a rotation of working with fibers and textiles as grief care from 3 different lenses. So the first month in September, we worked with slow stitching as grief care. Last month in October, we worked with yarn as grief care, whether that was knitting or crochet or whatever you want to do with the yarn. And this month, this coming week in November, we are working with mending, darning, patching, repair as grief care. So today I really just wanted to explain why. Why fiber arts? Why textile arts? Why thread, yarn, fabric as grief care? But before we begin, I just wanted to really invite you, if this episode speaks to you, to join us in Fibers of Grief. It's this Thursday, November 6th at 5:30 p.m. Pacific online. And I also want to offer that I have a free PDF guidebook all about slow stitching with grief that's available on my website. I'll link it below. It's pay what you can by donation. And it's the first installment of a larger guidebook that will include slow stitching, yarn work, and mending as grief care. So this first bit that I'm offering for free is just the slow stitching excerpt. The full guidebook isn't released yet. I'm still working on it. But you can download that excerpt as a preview, and I'll let you know when the full guidebook is ready for release. Okay, so I wanted to talk about my background with thread and yarn and textiles and explain how I've been working with it as grief care before diving into the specifics of how I facilitate a space. My interest around textiles and fibers as grief care started a few years ago. During the pandemic, I was deep in winter, and a lot of us during that time were turning towards so-called like granny hobbies. And I picked knitting back up, and I hadn't knitted in years. And I felt truly like I was tapping back into ancestral practices and traditions, and was reconnecting with women in my lineage who had died. My grandmother died just a few years before that, at the start of the pandemic. And so it was kind of a way for me to connect with her. She loved to knit. She knitted constantly. She was also the person who taught me how to sew. And so when I was deep in this yarn knitting as remembrance, I saw a post on Instagram for Melissa Word's Grief Threads, and so I joined Grief Threads 2 years ago. And Grief Threads is all about using scraps of primarily garments of loved ones who've lost, of our past selves that we're grieving, and creating quilts, patchwork. And I had never made a quilt before. I never really worked with textiles in this way. I majored in costume design in college, and so I've kind of looked at my sewing as big and flashy and made for the stage, and that really came in handy when I was performing as a drag king, so a lot of sequins, a lot of rhinestones, a lot of bright colors, and primarily made through machine sewing because you want it done quickly, right? And so I'd really disconnected with the slow, tempoed, rhythmic pace of hand stitching and of knitting. and realized that there was so much medicine here that I had forgotten. And so as I've returned to stitching, embroidery, knitting, learning kind of quilt by hand, and learning the magic of it all, and connecting with the truly ancient traditions of fiber arts. And primarily women, but not only women, have been working with thread and yarn and fabric for millennia across the globe. Each of us hold generations upon generations of this ancestral knowledge in our bodies. And time again, people have turned to these traditions in times of grief, not only to create something that is a memorial of the person who's died, but also as a way for us to process through hands. I learned in Grief Threads with Melissa Word that our hands hold so much wisdom and truly know the power of moving our hands in a rhythmic pattern as a way to process things that our brains just can't comprehend. You know, nowadays, our hands really only move in two ways. We type on a keyboard or when we scroll. And neither of those are really using our hands in a delicate and specialized and rhythmic enough way to really make an impact on our mental and emotional well-being, especially when we're grieving. You know, stitching and knitting offer tactile sensations and are ways that our ancestors have used their hands. And in that way, we're able to remember that people have survived grief for millennia. People have lived through grief and lived with grief for millennia. And this is just one way that they did. I learned recently about this incredible quilt that was made in the 1840s and 50s in Kentucky. It's called the Graveyard Quilt. It was made by Elizabeth Roseberry Mitchell. And it's this incredible quilt that is a map of the graveyard where her family is buried. She started it when one of her sons died. And so she quilted a map of the graveyard and the surroundings, and then included his gravesite with his name on it. And then as each person in her family died, she would applique a new tombstone and embroider their name onto it. In this way, she was not only mourning through her hands and creating something to remember them by, but it was really her way of documenting her family, her family's history, lineage, and so that they would be remembered. I'm also reminded of the AIDS Memorial Quilt, which is this incredible project that through quilts demanded the world to recognize the immense loss of life that was being lost due to the AIDS epidemic. And it's still an ongoing project. People can still submit blocks to the AIDS Memorial Quilt dedicated to someone they know, or maybe didn't know personally, that died of AIDS. And in this way, it shows how textile work as grief care can also be political. It can make a statement in a way that is softer. I'm thinking of Sarah Corbett, who lives in England, and she runs the Craftivist Collective. And she speaks a lot about how sometimes the best way to get a political message across is through fabric, because it instantly softens the message in a way that the person receiving it isn't so defensive, that they can really like feel the softness of the textile and hear what it's saying, hear the story that it's telling, and also the fact that they know that this took time. This took a long time to create. Someone really, really cared. So in that way, it's an incredible tool for political statements, especially in grief. And also quilts are a great way to make something communally. Oftentimes people will submit different blocks. I've seen trans memorial quilts dedicated to trans women and men who have been killed. People will submit blocks dedicated to someone, and they'll make a quilt out of those blocks. And I know I'm speaking a lot about quilts, but it's not just quilts. There's also the organization Stitch Their Names Together. It's being run by Mary Evers in Ireland, and it's dedicated to the people in Gaza who've been killed in this genocide. She invites people around the world to hand stitch, hand embroider the names of Palestinians and their ages who've been killed. And she's collecting all of these pieces and exhibiting them at galleries. And the impact is quite stunning. You are stunned, even through my little phone screen watching the videos. I feel stunned watching the names listed through thread. And again, it kind of just softens, warms, humanizes these people who should still be here. And so we find that working with thread and fabric and yarn is a way that largely women and femme people throughout history have told the stories that they didn't want to be forgotten, the stories of grief that deserved to be remembered. You can also see it in Persian rugs, another form of textile and thread work that I don't personally know how to do, but it's very much ingrained in our ancestral practices, especially if, like me, you're in the Iranian diaspora, right? Rugs take so long to make, and they're very repetitive, and they tell a story. The motifs are designed to tell the story. So in our monthly Fibers of Grief gatherings, I am not instructing, unfortunately, how to weave a Persian rug. And I'm really not instructing at all. The space isn't for me to teach anyone how to work with thread or yarn. I do welcome people of any skill level, but I do expect people to know to at least how to thread a needle, how to tie a knot at the end of the thread. And beyond that, there's really no right or wrong way to do it. And with the yarn gathering, people were welcome to knit or crochet, and I also offered the option of simply taking an object, a stick or something, and just wrapping the yarn around it, coiling the yarn around it. Because in every option of knitting, crocheting, or wrapping, you're still getting the same rhythmic, tactile experience, and especially the circular looping that occurs when you're working with yarn. As with all these practices, but yarn especially, it really asks us to consider how much tension we want to work with in our looping. I try in these spaces to encourage people not to try to make something in particular and to just sit with the feeling of the process. And so when we check in with our bodies at the start of the call, how is our grief feeling today? How much tension are we feeling in our bodies? And how does that want to be externalized through yarn? We can also consider what kind of yarn you want to work with. I do always recommend working with natural fiber yarn instead of synthetic because it really connects us to the literal sheep or alpaca or whatever animal, the literal animal that gifted us their fur, their hair, and also the hands that took that wool and spun it and dyed it, and the work that it took to get to this ball of yarn that we're working with. It's a reminder of the labor that goes into this, and also the labor that grief can feel like sometimes. Another reason why I like working with yarn is because at the end of our time, we can unravel it. We can look at what we created and simply just tug and watch the whole thing come undone. And in that way, we're tapping into the impermanence of life itself. We work so hard to create something, and then at the end, what's left? It is kind of ironic now that I think about it because, as I mentioned, my grandmother was an incredible knitter. And so much of what I have of hers that I get to hold on to is knitted sweaters and scarves, things that feel like a hug from her when I wrap my body in them. And yet they're so fragile and they get worn out, they get holes in them. And then I get to care for them the way that she did. And so it continues that cycle, you know? Even the pieces that we think are legacy pieces won't last forever. That's just how life is. For the slow stitching gathering, I really encourage people to choose their fabric and needle and thread with intention. Think about what they're needing in their grief. Do they feel fragile and delicate? Do they need a delicate fabric and a thin thread? Are they feeling full of rage and tension? Do they want a thick denim or something and a strong needle that they can really puncture and stab? And I found I also like the sound of a thread being pulled through a thick and tough fabric. And I like that tension and the strength it takes for me to really tug on that needle and that thread to get it through. It can feel really cathartic when so often we're told that we need to like keep it together to stay composed even when we're grieving. Sometimes stabbing something and tugging on something is what you need. And the magic of slow stitching is precisely in that slow part, really going slowly and being mindful, paying attention to the sounds, the texture of the fabric, the way that pushing the needle through the fabric and pulling it out the other side feel different in your body. And also how it feels to work with maybe a sentimental garment that reminds you of the person you miss. All of these things I'm laying out are mentioned in the Slow Stitching with Grief guidebook that I talked about at the beginning of the episode. So if you're interested in going deeper with these practices of needle and thread, that's available to you. And then the third theme of our Fibers of Grief circle is mending. And mending, of course, has so many metaphors when it comes to grief. Our hearts are broken after the death of someone we love, and also our life feels like it's in pieces and that we'll never feel whole again. And so mending really is the perfect metaphor of how do we not necessarily fix our hearts and souls, but how do we just like piece it together to make something new. Visible mending, especially, is such a great practice because it removes the pressure of having to do it neatly. There's no need to be tidy. There's no need for it to be invisible, to be hidden. Visible mending allows the grief to be part of the story of the garment or the bag or whatever it is that you're mending, as a way to say, yes, I've lived through this. Acknowledge that. I'm not going to hide it anymore. And so when we do these practices of mending or slow stitching or knitting and crocheting, it's kind of magical how doing it together in an online space provides just enough gentle structure, a skeleton of structure that allows for things to come up that wouldn't on your own. We spend about 10 minutes, 15 minutes doing introductions, reflecting on the medium that we'll be working with. I lead a guided meditation with the materials. And then we spend about an hour just sitting together without music, screens and microphones on. And there's a lot of silence. There's a lot of silence. And that's absolutely fine. It's in that silence and togetherness that things come through as we're keeping our minds occupied with the handicraft, allowing our hands to keep our minds from thinking too much. We're able to listen to what's underneath that, listen to the wisdom that's coming through these ancestral practices. And people are welcome to share those revelations, reflections, observations throughout our time together. And it's been really beautiful hearing the things that come through. We often end with people saying that they're realizing that they're grieving for more than they thought they were. And that the fabric and thread and yarn help them realize that. So I invite you to either join us in Fibers of Grief this week, if you're able, for a mending session, or download the Slow Stitching with Grief guidebook. Or even right now, if you're able, to just notice the clothing that you're wearing, feel its texture on your skin. Think of the animals and water and hands that went into creating those garments, and how your essence has been infused into these fabrics, into these fibers, that our garments carry our smells, our stories, our memories. And as we wear them, they get worn out, they get holes, the fabric is stretched thin, just as we are as we move through life. If this episode has spoken to you, if it's brought up anything for you, you're welcome to send me an email, send me a message on Instagram. You can even send me a voice note, share the podcast, subscribe to it, leave a rating and review, all that good stuff. It means a lot to me, and I would appreciate it so much. Thank you.